Okay, this will kind of be very informal, so if you got questions, just ask along the way. But I've got a slide presentation I'll show here, but I do also have some live things I brought with me. So at some point I'll stop and either pass things around or show you things or let you touch or look at something, that sort of stuff. So, so it's identifying amphibians and snakes in the garden is, I guess, the title of this workshop here. Let's talk about amphibians first. That's frogs, toads, and salamanders, in case you were wondering. So we're going to talk about them as a group. And amphibians are animals that have to have some connection to water. So they're always going back to water to lay their eggs, breed, that sort of stuff. But they can be found just about anywhere. But they usually like some kind of a damp habitat, some more than others. But they're definitely animals that might turn up in a garden space. And that's actually a good thing because the amphibians feed on insects primarily. Some larger amphibians feed on smaller amphibians. Other amphibians feed primarily on insects, small invertebrates. Some of those would be things that you would not possibly want in your garden. So an amphibian of any kind should be welcome in your garden, I would think, because of their diet of eating insects and creatures like that. We're going to kind of talk about frogs and toads first. And even though there's a lot of amphibians out there, particularly in this area where we're at today, which is western North Carolina. In fact, when it comes to salamanders, this is the salamander capital of the world. We have more species of salamanders than any other animal. Than any other place in the world, basically. Scientists literally come here to study salamanders because they're so numerous here. And they're occasionally found in the garden too. We'll talk about that. But it's probably going to be more frogs and toads and might make the bigger impact as far as looking for something that eats insects and things in your garden. They're probably the ones that would show up the most. And we're not going to talk about every species of amphibian that's found around here. I'm just going to kind of concentrate on the species of amphibians that would probably be the ones that you'd most likely to see in a garden situation. It's helpful to know a little bit about a life cycle of these things too, because if you actually want to encourage them, there's one thing just seeing them from time to time, but if you actually want to encourage them as part of the natural cycle of the landscape there and to help them actually eat bugs and things in your yard, garden, or wherever you want them to have, you want to be able to invite them and set up a proper habitat for them. So it's nice to know a little bit about their life cycle, and that will indicate why they might turn up where you never expected them to be anyway. And if you want to attract them, then you'll know what to do to attract them. So basically, amphibians, as I mentioned, they're tied to water, and they need to be around water for breeding purposes and laying their eggs. But it depends on what kind of an amphibian. Certain permanent bodies of water that have fish are not necessarily good amphibian habitats. They can be for certain types of amphibians, but generally when amphibians lay their eggs, they're laying their eggs in water. And if you have fish, they're going to eat the amphibian eggs. The only alternative that would be in very shallow water areas that have a lot of emergent vegetation. Some amphibians can use that perimeter area where the fish can't get into, where it's very weedy, choked with vegetation. Other than that, a lot of times amphibians utilize temporary bodies of water. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment as well. So permanent bodies of water obviously will attract amphibians and to lay their eggs there, but possibly live there as adults. But not all amphibians live around the water all the time as an adult. Something that's need to know a little bit about if you're talking about amphibians are vernal pools. And vernal pools are basically pools of water that form after a winter. It could be from melting snow and ice. It could just be from spring thunderstorms. Actually, a lot of these form in mid to late winter. That's the primary time for a lot of amphibian breeding. And a vernal pool is simply a pool that is temporary. So some people might call that a big puddle, and actually puddles, or I don't like to call things mud puddles, but puddles that just low-lying depressions in the ground that collect water and might be just a few inches deep and a couple of feet across are actually very important amphibian breeding grounds. But we call these things technically vernal pools if they occur naturally because they're temporary and they don't last very long. Another word would be ephemeral pools as well. But they can be larger, they can be many yards across, a foot or two deep, but once in a while they dry up, and that keeps permanent fish populations from getting in them. If you look at this slide right here, we'll come back to it in a moment here, but there's a bunch of frog eggs right in the foreground there, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But vernal pools are these temporary pools of water, and they can be man-made if you're trying to attract amphibians to your yard or a landscape or a garden area. And they don't have to be very big, just a few inches deep, a few feet across, and probably better to be a little bit of sun and a little bit of shade rather than be out in full sun. But you want them, that's to hold water for several months, usually from the middle of the winter until at least mid-summer or something like that. And then you can actually let them dry up if you wanted to, because most of the amphibian breeding that was going on in those would have taken place by that point in time. But you might, if you have an artificial situation like this you've actually made, you might want to let water just stay in there, but just don't let fish ever get established in there. So if they might occur naturally, like the side of a road, this is a roadside where a ditch has been stopped up and it's just become a vernal pool because of water draining down off the side of a hill. This is where actually another vernal pool that was formed where somebody was doing ditching and grading along a gravel road, and they just dug a ditch to channel water off the roadside, and it forms a vernal pond. But you know, this one is you can tell it's had a lot more water than it has right now. It's actually starting to dry up, and that's the thing about vernal pools, these ephemeral ponds. They do dry up from time to time, and if they're occurring in a natural situation, sometimes they dry up while amphibians have used them and before the amphibians can complete their life cycle in there, and they can become bone dry. So you can lose a whole generation of amphibians. But because of that, amphibians are what we call explosive breeders. So they lay tens of thousands of eggs usually in hope that a few of them will make it to adulthood and make it all the way, you know, through the life cycle. So you can recognize amphibian eggs usually. They're kind of jelly coated. They may occur in large masses. This is a mass of frog eggs here that's probably about the size of your fist, often clumped together. Not all amphibian eggs look just like that, but they're all kind of jelly coated. Usually have the embryonic center that you see there, a little black dot. Amphibians, if they're frogs or toads, they hatch into tadpoles, and tadpoles can be identified basically as to what time of the year you find them and what particular type of a wetland you find their eggs that have hatched into tadpoles in. These are toad tadpoles. They're very small, very black, and there's tens of thousands of them, and they're usually laid in very temporary pools of water, literally sometimes ruts in old woods roads and places like that. It doesn't take much for a toad to take advantage of. When these amphibian eggs hatch, they hatch into tadpoles, whether it's a frog or a toad. For the first couple of days, they have actually external gills. These things here are about the size of a grain of rice or just a little bit bigger. And you can see external gills on there, but after 2 or 3 days, they absorb those and they have internal gills for the rest of their developmental period. While they're in the water, they feed on algae, little small plants that what a lot of people just call pond scum. It's not the most prettiest thing in the water, but it's actually food for them, and anything else that's plant-related, vegetative in the water, they'll feed on. And if something like another tadpole dies, they'll feed on that as well. But they're primarily vegetarians, have little rasping tongues. After a period of a few weeks to a few months, depending on the temperature of the water, the location of the pool, they begin to start their development into a land-going terrestrial adult. And when you see small little hind legs forming, you know they're about to transform. And most of these things transform within the same season that they themselves were hatched from eggs. So if you saw frog eggs in February or March, usually by midsummer or even before that, you're probably going to have some little frogs or little baby toads. But some others, like bullfrogs, actually have a longer developmental period, and they may take 2 or even 3 years in some locations to go through the entire tadpole stage to go to an adult. But as soon as you see legs sprouting, you know they're on the way within a few weeks or a couple months to becoming an adult.
So how do they make it through the vernal pool if it dries up?
Well, they don't. That's just it. So sometimes a whole generation is lost. So that's the thing about these vernal pools. They take a chance on using them. Hopefully there'll be enough rainwater to come and replenish them. But if it was a permanent body of water, there would be fish there, and they would be all gobbled up to begin with anyway. So some years have great reproduction, other years they don't. So good question though. Of course, if you have a vernal pool that you have made, man-made, make sure it's filled with water. So once they start getting those little hind legs coming on, then the little front legs start to pop out. And as you see, they're very, very tiny, depending on the species. And then they're undergoing such a change. They're undergoing a change from a vegetarian diet, and they have to be a carnivore when they're an adult. And so at this point, they start to absorb their tail for nutrition. And sometimes people raise little tadpoles and things in a classroom situation. And when they get to this stage, they forget these guys are getting little legs, and they have to climb out of the water. They can literally drown if they cannot climb out of water at this point. So a vernal pool is usually shallow, but it has sticks and branches that have fallen in there, old leaves, so they easily climb in and out of there. They start to absorb their tail nutrition as the internal organs are changing to a carnivorous diet. And then depending on whether they're a frog or toad, whatever, they become a little tiny miniature of the adult and leave the water, usually on a very rainy day sometimes. In fact, the old timers used to say it's raining frogs and toads after a thunderstorm you see in late spring or early summer, because you see so many little baby frogs and toads, they actually thought they came down with the rain. But they just use that to disperse into the nearby woodlands because they want to be damp. Toads live primarily on the land surface. There are many species of frogs that come from the vernal pools as tadpoles that actually live in the woodlands, still returning to lay their eggs in the water. But there are some frog species that have a tendency to live more around the edges of wetlands than other species. But a lot of them actually leave the pools and actually go to the woodlands for most of their adult life, returning only to lay their eggs. So let's talk a little about species accounts. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the different species here that would be found in a garden situation that you might see or you might want to encourage. Also, we'll talk a little bit more maybe about the life cycle, a little bit depending on the certain species, because some of them are a little bit different as far as their eggs go, their tadpoles, that sort of thing. So around here in the Appalachian mountain areas in the southern United States here, not down in the Piedmont, down in the coastal plain either, but just in the mountainous areas and throughout much of eastern North America in the higher upland areas, we have this species called the wood frog. And the wood frog is a species of an amphibian that you probably might have in a garden situation, but you might never see it. They actually live in woodlands nearby, near the wood pools that they use to lay their eggs in. But they don't spend a lot of time above ground. They spend most of their time down under the leaves. Even in the summertime, when they're not breeding, they spend most of their time under the leaves. One time though you'll see them is usually, depending on the weather situation, mid to late February, early March. The wood frogs, under the cover of darkness and a particular rain that comes in mid to late winter, that is of duration, it rains into the evening hours, into the nighttime hours, and raises the air temperature up to 45 degrees or more. It's very specific. When that happens mid to late winter, you'll have wood frogs wake up from hibernation down in the leaves of the forest floor, and they start to hop downhill, and they go to these little vernal pools that have formed to lay their eggs. And as you see, they look exactly like the leaves around them. They've got a little black mask on either side of the face. I call them the raccoon of the frog world because that little black or brownish mask. And they just got amazing camouflage, but they're a very secretive frog that very few people know exist unless you're out on rainy nights after dark in mid to late February, early March, and most people aren't. So these wood frogs come out from under the leaves. They hop to these vernal pools under the cover of darkness. And sometimes, because the temperature is real critical for them to come, in particular mountainous areas, sometimes you'll have temperatures in the mid to upper 40s, and it's just borderline for them to be able to move to a pool of water and waking up from their hibernation. But then suddenly the weather changes, and the weather can change very much in the mountains. Suddenly you have temperature drops 5 degrees or 10 degrees or something, and suddenly you're getting sleet instead of rain. And sometimes that happens right when they're in the midst of moving to breeding pools. I have a couple of vernal pools, man-made, that I have in my yard that attract a lot of these amphibians. This is one that came on a night when it was just borderline conditions. And as it got close to the pool, the weather changed, the temperature dropped, and suddenly, being a cold-blooded amphibian, it couldn't move anymore because suddenly it was in a pile of sleet, and it was just stuck there. It couldn't go any further. Amphibians and other cold-blooded animals, when they get very cold, they can't move. But it's really interesting. These guys can actually survive freezing if a predator doesn't get them, because they pack sugars in the middle part of their body that acts like an antifreeze to protect the inner core of their body. So they're actually a species of frog that's found almost all the way to the Arctic Circle. So they're very easy for them to survive freezing cold temperatures, but they can't move very well when it's very cold. So this frog got stuck. I found him in my yard in a pile of sleet, halfway to the vernal pool, put him in my hands, let him kind of thaw out a little bit, and then carried them the final 30 feet to the pool and put him in. So, let them continue what they're doing. But that just shows you the borderline temperatures that they operate under. And they are the first frog to breed in our area here, coming sometimes as early as mid-January, but usually at February and March. The males usually arrive first, and they float around on the surface of these little pools of water, and they call to the females with a very unusual kind of a quacking duck-like call. It's very unusual, not very loud, and that attracts the females. The females are voiceless, and then the females arrive, and eventually the females lay their eggs, the males fertilize their eggs as they're being laid, and they leave behind the large egg masses that we saw in the first picture of a vernal pool there, these big frog eggs floating around. They hatch sometimes in a week or so, but if the temperature is very cold, the wood frogs might stay in that pool of water. Temperatures freeze, they might not have actually gotten their breeding completely done. They might actually get trapped in those pools of water for 4 or 5 weeks until temperatures warm up again. And then they resume their breeding once the eggs are laid. Then on a rainy night, cover of darkness, like brought them in the same conditions, and they go back to their homes in the woods and burrow down under the leaves and are not usually seen for many weeks or months, if at all, anymore in the season. So they leave behind their eggs, and those are the eggs that we see very early in the season when you see little small tadpoles hatching out in these little shallow pools of water. Not long after the wood frogs lay their eggs, we have other frog species and toad species that come in on a routine basis, one after another. The next one that we start to see a lot of times in late February, early March would be spring peepers. And spring peepers are very tiny, as you see. Here's an average adult, about the size of a quarter. Male's a little smaller, female's a little bit bigger. And this is one that a lot of people hear is sometimes called a harbinger of spring, because when they first start to call, it's starting to get spring-like conditions out there. The evenings may be very warm, but then later in the night it gets cool, maybe even drop down to freezing later on. But we're having warmer days, and spring peepers like to call in the evenings with a high-pitched peeping sound. It almost sounds like a bird-like call, kind of a one individual peeper. But when you get a chorus of them, sometimes there's dozens or even hundreds of them in these little wetland pools, it almost can hurt your ears. It's absolutely incredible. But roadside ditches filled with water qualify as vernal pools. Pools that form in fields and pastures or gardens or any place like that classifies as a vernal pool. They may utilize those conditions, and they're just a very common sound that we hear in certain locations during the winter time. And I say midwinter or late winter, really actually before true spring actually gets here. Notice they have a little X on their back, kind of a tan brownish color as well. And their coloration makes them blend in very well. Their small size makes them almost impossible to see. But these guys have spent the winter down in the leaves like the wood frogs. But they come out and lay their eggs and then go back to the woodlands. But they're actually a species of tree frog, a very weak tree frog. So they can actually climb upwards in trees and branches, but not very high, just a few feet off the ground. So you may hear them calling from an elevated position, but when they're actually breeding, they're going to be actually on the ground in the water with those little high-pitched peeping sounds. There's a male and a female together, very tiny little guys. But I always call them, say they're the frog with a big, tiny frog with a big voice. It's absolutely incredible how loud amphibians can be when they're calling, because they have a vocal sac that expands as a resonating chamber, and that makes a very loud sound. But even though it's very loud, it's sometimes impossible almost to find these guys. They blend in so well with the dead branches and leaves and dead hummocks of grass that they're sitting on and amongst the water on the forest floor there, that you could be looking right at them and not even see them. So sometimes it takes a lot of effort to actually locate these little guys. As I'm talking about some of these things, I'm going to actually pass around a few samples. Don't worry, they're in a jar. But these are live creatures. And so we're talking about spring peepers right now. He's on the side of the glass here a little bit, but I'll pass that around and let everybody be looking at that. So you can see the size of a spring peeper actually is. They're such a small little creature. So spring peepers, high-pitched peeping sound. Another frog you might find around a garden situation and would be a pickerel frog. And they're not small like the little spring peeper. Spring peeper is about the size of your thumbnail. Pickerel frogs are much bigger. You can put 2 or 3 of them in your hand. And they're kind of a frog that moves around. Most of our frog species are going to be active at night, but mostly on rainy nights. So if you go out to the garden or something on a rainy night, that's when you're going to find these things. But during the daytime, you're not typically going to see most frog species. They're going to be pretty much hidden. But they move around when it's raining. That stimulates them to move around. Pickerel frogs also lay their eggs in temporary pools of water, but a lot of times they're a little bit bigger pools of water than something like some of these other amphibians use. Sometimes we don't see their eggs as often, but we sometimes hear them. If you go out on these rainy nights and you have a wetland nearby, you'll hear these guys. They have a call that sounds like a snoring call, just like a person snoring. but not very loud. That's the call of the pickerel frog. But they have a tendency to colonize many different water situations. Also on rainy nights, they may be found nowhere near water, hopping around looking for food. So they might definitely come hopping on a rainy night through your garden, grabbing insects here and there. And one of the ones that's really common throughout much of eastern North America here is a green frog. And green frogs are about the same size as the pickerel frog we just saw. But even though they're called a green frog, they're not always green. They're sometimes a drab, kind of a grayish, dark greenish. Usually they're kind of green on their face, but they can change colors. If they're in the darkness, kind of a dark area with not a lot of light or something like that, sometimes they darken up. If they're exposed to the sunlight a little bit more, they may be a little more greenish in color. But they're one of the few frogs that you'll actually see during the daylight hours. And they colonize permanent bodies of water, but also semi-permanent bodies of water, also little vernal pools. They'll hang around those areas. And the type of frog that likes to come out and be about one jump away from the water's edge. So they actually come out during the daylight hours, sun themselves, which is very unusual for a frog species. And if you ever walk around a wetland and you see a frog jump in, and if you're listening and hear a eek sound, that's probably the green frog. They just kind of announce their presence as they're jumping. Question?
Do all frogs have a resonating chamber?
The males all do. They pump their voice up with that resonating chamber, but the females don't have that. Yeah. So that's how they can be very loud. So, and that's not the breeding call. That's just the call in response to something frightening them and trying to create a little illusion about where they are or where they're not, a little diversion as they jump. It kind of startles a predator or something, and, that helps them make their getaway. But it's kind of interesting how they love to be literally one jump away, which is usually 4 or 5 feet from the water's edge, and they're always facing the water, ready to go back in. But because they actually leave the water and do that, then they can get insects that are on land that other frogs aren't going to get. They're hanging around the water's edge more. So it's a pretty good technique for them, and then they blend in so well that most things don't even see them to begin with. But their call, the breeding call, is kind of like, sounds like a plucking of a banjo string that's really loose, kind of a, and not the croaking like you hear of Kermit the Frog, ribbit, rib, ribbit, nothing like that. Most of these frogs have very, very different calls. So green frogs are real common around garden situations if you have wetlands nearby. But wetlands for frogs, we're not talking about necessarily big ponds and lakes. We're talking about that little roadside ditch, that little stream that flows through your garden, or water's edge, wood's edge, something like that, or those temporary little pools, that form in low-lying areas. All those are magical wetlands for all kinds of amphibians.
How large are the grand and the pickerel frogs?
How large? About half the size of my hand, a really big one sitting with its legs folded up. Yeah. And there's one sitting out in the edge of a little vernal pool there, and that's typical. If they're in the water, they're hiding a little bit in the water, but if they're on land, they're completely exposed and ready to jump back in the water at a moment's notice. Now they have a bigger cousin called the bullfrog, the American bullfrog, and these guys, if you're holding one, it will probably take up most of your hand if it's an adult one. With their legs extended, they can literally be 8 to 10 inches long or longer. And bullfrogs are one of the most famous frog species that most people know about. They've been expanding their range, and they have a big appetite. But they not only have they been known to eat lots and lots of small bugs and insects, things like that, they've actually been known to eat small rodents, believe it or not. In some of the southern swamps, very large bullfrogs have been known to eat hatchling alligators, believe it or not. They're coming out of the egg, they're very tiny. So these guys are an awesome predator, but they'll also eat other frogs. So because of that, you might consider them to be a little undesirable because they can eat other desirable species, but they have a big appetite and they're a very big frog. So they're true cannibals, but bullfrogs are pretty interesting creatures. And kind of like the green frog, which they resemble, they actually like to be out sometimes during the daylight hours. Sometimes they'll be actually in the water, but exposed a little bit, and then if something is dangerous, then they'll go back in the water. But they are species that really likes more permanent bodies of water than some of these other amphibians. But you'll definitely find them on rainy nights almost anywhere. They recolonize areas on rainy nights. They start to hop and move and spread out to other areas, and they can turn up just about anywhere and at just about any time. So bullfrogs are pretty common. Bullfrog tadpoles are commonly kept by people that have garden ponds. They like to have them because the tadpoles take 2 or 3 years to mature. A very large bullfrog tadpole, before it actually matures completely, might be as much as 8 inches long. They're very huge. They live a long time. Very interesting frog species. Easily kept in a pond situation, but sooner or later they will metamorphose. The hind legs start to come in, the front legs start to come in, and right now this guy looks like he's half frog, half tadpole. And as soon as he absorbs that tail, he's ready to go. But it's kind of funny, a bullfrog tadpole is a big tadpole. The adult bullfrog is very large, but when they start to go through the metamorphosis stage and they absorb their tail, then they shrink down to where they're actually very small compared to what they're going to be one day. They actually get very small, as you see, compared to a nickel there. So when you see just a recently metamorphosed bullfrog, they're not very big at all. You would think it was some other species, but then they grow quickly, and within a few months they're starting to get really, really large. And there's a typical little recently metamorphosed bullfrog in the palm of the hand, showing about the average size. Never suspecting that would be such a big bullfrog a little bit later on in life. Around houses and homes, garden situations also, this is another frog we see quite a bit. It's a woodland frog, but it travels quite a bit on rainy nights, and it's also looking around for these temporary pools of water to lay their eggs. A lot of times if you have a bucket sitting out, maybe to water plants, a 5-gallon bucket or a trough, galvanized tub or something like that, these guys will lay their eggs in it. So they utilize very small bodies of water to lay their eggs, and they leave little jelly-like eggs that are kind of floating on the surface of the water. But they have a breeding season that normally lasts from about May, which is right now when we're doing this program, actually all the way through the end of spring and into summer, maybe as late as July and August in some areas. Pretty long breeding season. Once again, most people don't see these things. They see the eggs maybe that left behind in those temporary places. But these guys are very unusual, not only for their life cycle and where they lay their eggs, but also because of where they live and how they look. I mean, these are true tree frogs that live high in the trees. They hibernate in the ground, down under the leaf surface there on the forest floor. But they come out in the spring, they climb up into tall trees. You see they have very large sticky toe pads. These guys are sometimes called tree toads because they have a little bit of a short, dumpy appearance with a kind of a rough glandular skin that looks a little more like toad-like, and the toads we'll be talking about in a moment. But they're actually a frog, and the main thing I think is their camouflage is absolutely amazing. There are different shades of gray and green and beige, and they can actually change their colors to very closely resemble their background. And here's an average size female gray tree frog in a hand. Females are bigger than the males. Some of the males will be more about the size of a quarter, females about the size of a 50-cent piece. Notice this one is very dark. Their color changes depending on whether they're in the sunlight or the temperature change. And normally whatever the amount of light they're getting, the temperature change, it just ends up opening and closing the pores of the skin to resemble to make certain pigments become noticeable, and that just kind of magically ends up making them match their background. Now they can't turn colors like purple or blue or something like that, but they're natural colors that are earth tones, greens, grays, browns, and darks like this. They just magically seem to be able to match that color, but it's not something they think about. It's just in response to to heat and light and environmental change like that, just makes them match the background. So there's one that's kind of turning blackish or dark in color. Here's one on the side of a tree, sitting there climbing a tree, and if you were walking by a few feet away and that frog did not move, that's just such amazing camouflage. It looks like the different shades of gray and the lichens that you see on the side of a tree, and just really amazing that they can do that, plus also climb with those sticky toe pads. They can actually turn a greenish color, matches the leaves out on the tree limbs if they're up high, and the little babies, when they metamorphose from tadpoles, they're actually a very bright grassy green as they actually disperse and hop through the grass and vegetation on the forest floor. So these are amazing little guys here, but definitely something that you will find in a garden situation. And they've got a pretty good appetite, eating things that are sometimes almost as big as they are. They just cram it in their mouths, so they can eat some very large insects that you might not want to have in your garden. They also have a very large vocal sac when they call, and they have a kind of a high-pitched trill, but it's a very short, harsh trill like that. and you'll hear it sometimes from a high elevated position, or as when they actually start to breed, it'll be down low in the ground in these little pools, these little vernal pools. And a lot of times, even in farmers' fields, I'll see where rainwater just literally stands in low-lying fields and pastures where crops are grown, and gray tree frogs love those kinds of situations with just a few inches of water there. As long as that water stays for a couple months, is replenished by thunderstorms, provides ideal conditions for these little frogs to lay their eggs. So they'll definitely turn up in your garden, and sometimes even on the windows at night with their sticky toe pads as they climb. So those are the most common frogs that you might see in our area here in a garden situation. Once again, a lot of times they're nocturnal. You may not see them, but particularly on rainy nights, know they're out there hopping around, eating bugs, that sort of stuff. And if you want to have them around, provide a vernal pool. Make a pool. You can make a pool out of many different things. You can buy the rubberized compounds, pool liners, and dig a free-form place in the ground and lay down a pool liner and make a little vernal pool that way, and then line it with rocks, and eventually other things will grow around the edge, and you have just a little miniature pond, whatever size you want it to be. You can actually buy fiberglass pools pre-made that people put in their yards, and the main thing is you don't want a fountain in there. You don't want a bunch of flowing water. They like kind of still water, but you can buy things like that pre-made, ready to go. So a lot of people have these decorative ponds and pools that they put in their backyards, and as long as you don't let fish get in those, don't put goldfish in them, don't put anything like that in, large and small, those pools will attract these things naturally if you live in an area where they're at. So it might not happen the first year or the second year, but within 2 or 3, 4 years or so, unless you live in the middle of downtown somewhere, sooner or later these animals are going to populate your little pool, and you'd be surprised that even in some urban situations where you might have a garden, you put a vernal pool, these things will show up. So they often live close to people. Yes?
Will those frogs control mosquitoes that also have?
That's a great question, because when you have still water, the big thing about still stagnant water is you don't want to have mosquitoes in there. Now, the tadpoles that hatch from these guys do not eat mosquito larvae. They eat primary plants and water, but there are other amphibians we're getting ready to talk about in the world of salamanders that definitely do eat mosquito larvae. But what happens also, if you have any of these little vernal pools and you start getting amphibians laying their eggs in there, then you're also going to have other creatures that come there. There's a lot of small macroinvertebrates, insects that have a larval stage that lives in the water, like dragonfly nymphs and things like that. And all those little creatures do eat anything else that they can find in the water. So they're little carnivores. So, usually I don't have a mosquito problem with my vernal pools because it's so full of amphibian life, not only of these types of things, but other things like salamander larvae that are carnivorous, and then these other, like I said, macroinvertebrates like dragonfly nymphs, others that come in, and they gobble up the mosquito larvae. The worst thing about mosquito larvae is they get established in wetlands where there's nothing else living. So if you have that bucket of water sitting out, or that tire that collects water, or that gutter that's stopped up, with just a little bit of stagnant water, and it doesn't take much, just a handful of water, that's where the mosquitoes normally are going to lay their eggs. And they're not doing it as much in these bigger vernal pools because there's so many things that are going to eat them there. So, but that's a good question to ask. Yes. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about toads. I think toads are probably found in the garden a little bit more than frogs, and it may be because toads spend their time in the garden a lot more than frogs. Frogs may live in a leaf litter or in a wetland edge near your garden or something like that, but toads actually like to dig down in the soil of your garden. And as you're out there plowing, digging, weeding, whatever, you might uproot a toad because that's where they spend their daytime hours. But at night, they're definitely hopping around in those situations looking for bugs. So most gardeners will see more toads than will frogs. And frogs are hard to catch and observe. Toads hop, frogs leap. Frogs are slimy and gooey and wet, very slick and hard to hold on. Toads have a drier skin, spend more time on land. So gardeners get more familiar with toads than do some of these other things. So we're going to talk a little bit about toads here. So the difference between toads and frogs is basically toads are more land-based as an adult than frogs are, but many frogs are as well. Toads can have a drier skin, so they can actually be in more dry situations than frogs can as an adults. Toads love to dig in the ground to hide. Frogs usually dig under leaf litter or something like that to hide. Toads have skin glands that actually have some secretions that are somewhat toxic. We'll talk more about that for protection. They have shorter legs for hopping, where frogs do more leaping. But they're tied to water just like these other amphibians, so they have to have water to lay their eggs in, but it doesn't take much water for a toad to lay its eggs in. As I said before, they actually sometimes lay their eggs in rutted little tractor ruts or something, or in an old woods road or something. Something that might just be a foot long and 2 or 3 inches deep can hold hundreds of toad tadpoles. And the developmental period for toads to metamorphose into tiny little toadlets is a lot less time than some of the frogs take. So in this area where we're at here in western North Carolina, in the mountainous areas here, we primarily have 2 species of toads that we would most likely see. The one that's most common is American toad. I'll pass one of those around here in just a moment. And the American toad, I love that name, and that very patriotic name, American toad. You got to have that in your garden, right? So American toads can get to be almost, a big female might fill up the better part of your hand, but females are bigger than the males. But toads are warty, they're bumpy and lumpy, and there's a lot of folklore about toads because people come into contact with toads a lot. And if you pick up a toad, one of the first things they'll do to try to get away from you is they'll literally pee on you. They actually hold a lot of water in about it. You know, if you want to get technical, some of that's not true pee, but they have a body opening called the cloaca, and they have a chamber in there where they hold a lot of extra water inside of their body. And if something grabs them and they think it's predatory, something's going to harm them, they will just subtly let all that come out, and you think you're being peed on. And nothing likes to be peed on. You know, it's a sudden shock to a wild creature, but a person doesn't like that either. So you'll put that toad down or something. So that's a great predatory thing they have to scare people away. But old timers used to say that toads would give you warts, and that's if you handle them, and that was like one of the things that would give you warts. Because if you look at a toad, they're covered by warts, it looks like, but those bumps and lumps are not actually warts at all. Those are actually skin glands, and they actually contain a white toxic fluid in there that we'll talk more about. But that provides a good protection for a toad. But toads are rough skinned. They have those lumps and bumps, and those are toxic skin glands. American toads come in a variety of colors, large and small. Some are more olive green, gray, brick red. They also change their color a little bit according to the amount of sunlight they're in, or the temperature it is, or so they can, you know, it's just amazing. Some will have a stripe down their back, you know, but they're just very, very interesting and very, very variable. And that's what we see in American toad quite a bit. The males are smaller than the females, and this is a big full-grown female in the hand below to show you the general size. Typical average adult male in the hand to the upper left there. But of course you find toads large and small that aren't full-grown yet. And but if you pick up a toad and it talks to you, not literally talking, but makes any kind of a sound, you know it's a male. Male toads have a throat patch that swells, and they make a call just like the other amphibian species, but it's also kind of dark under the throat. But if you pick them up, they also have a little predatory response. They may pee in your hand, but if you keep holding on to them, they may also do a kind of a chirping kind of a call, and it's kind of they're kind of basically saying, leave me alone, let me go, that sort of stuff. But it's such a very unusual sound. It's very bird-like little chirping sound. It's very pleasant sounding, but that would be a male. So let's see, we got a male toad here we can pass around, and we got a little male here. In fact, I'm just going to pick him and just see if he might chirp for us. Once you've had a toad in captivity for a while, they stop doing that, but usually when you catch one right out of a while, they will. But this one might do it. So let me hold him here for just a moment. Can you hear that? Little chirping sound. Sounds more like a little bird or something, doesn't it? Yeah, so he's begging me to put him down. He's got a dark throat here, but if he was calling for a mate, that would swell very large, and he'd have a very different high-pitched trilling sound, kind of which might go on for like 30, 45 seconds or so. And in early springtime, I love to hear the toads call on rainy nights from the little pools of water, because one toad will trill like that, and another toad will trill maybe a half an octave higher or a half octave lower. And it's almost like you hear this little symphony of trilling toads in the background. They're calling across the valley, particularly in this area where we live here. We have lots of toads here. But this is the little cry to let me go, not the breeding call. But we'll put him in a jar here. Now, this jar says Fowler's toad. This is an American toad. I didn't change the label on this jar. So don't think this is a Fowler's toad, which is the other toad species we have in this area. But this is an American toad male. So we'll pass him around and let you look at him. And then we'll be looking at an American toad female here, coming up here in just a moment. So let's talk about those glands a little bit more, because that's something important about a toad. You know, toads are easy to catch. You know, frogs are hard to catch. They might live near water. They jump in the water. If you grab them, they're slick, hard to hold on to. They have really long leaps. Toads do little hops, short legs. So toads have to have the extra special defenses to protect themselves. And if they pee on a predator and that doesn't make you let them go, then their next source of protection is these skin glands. They have two big glands, one behind each eye. It looks like a potato almost. And these are called parotoid glands. But any raised, swelled area on the body that looks like a wart is also another gland. This is just the ones that have the most toxin or poison in them. And if you handle a toad, it's no problem. But if you were to bite into a toad, handle a toad rough as if you were a predator trying to eat it, then suddenly sticky white mucousy fluid comes out of these sticky glands here. And I'll show you in just a moment. Here's a male on the left with a dark throat patch, female. No throat patch, just a white throat there, just so you can tell. But here's a toad. You see on the parotoid glands, you'll see on the one on the right behind the eye, looking at the toad from the upper surface, you see a little white sticky fluid coming out. That's called bufotoxin. It looks like white school glue that you're using to glue something, like Elmer's glue or something like that. And it's very, very sticky, and it tastes very bitter. And if a toad is very roughly handled, or if a toad is attacked, it gets a lot of that coming out. You see us getting on the finger there. But that's very toxic. It tastes bitter. If you were to, as a human, to get some in your mouth, it would just taste very bitter. But if you were a small animal that got a lot of that in your mouth, it would make you convulse. You might have hallucinations. You might actually have an increased heartbeat rate because you're being poisoned. And if you were a very small animal, you could actually even die. Yes?
It's bufotoxin. Isn't bufo like the class?
Yeah, very good. If you're talking about the scientific names of these creatures, the genus, the scientific name is bufo.
And it's a toxin.
Yeah, and the toxin, which is a poison, bufotoxin. Very good.
Bullfrog, bufo. And then what's the American?
The American toad is Bufo americanus. But the bullfrog is a ranid, which is a ranidae, the family of bullfrogs. So it's got a different genus and species name. Yeah. So there's your bufotoxin. And sometimes dogs will occasionally grab a toad because they're easy to catch. You know, we have dogs living around our homes and gardens and places like that. And if you've ever observed a dog, you know, dogs are descended from wolves. They still have these wild tendencies to grab things that are moving. You know, they don't know what to do with it sometimes. But they get a mouthful of this bufotoxin, they'll start to shake, they'll shiver, their eyes will quiver, their pupils will get very dilated, they'll start to retch and vomit and actually slobber from the mouth because of the taste of this and being poisoned. But it's usually a short-term poison. After a few minutes they calm down, their heartbeat slows down, but they learn not to go near another toad again, hopefully. But we sometimes see that in domestic pets when they've had an encounter with a toad. But toads should not be considered to be a liability to have around. That's just their defense. And most wild animals leave them alone. There's a few animals like hognose snakes and garter snakes that will eat toads. Skunks and possums may eat toads, a few creatures like that. But instinctively, most animals know to stay away from it. But toads have a big appetite, and they eat a lot of bugs. So a toad in your garden is an absolutely good thing. So American toads are real common around here. The other we might find would be a Fowler's toad. Usually a little smaller, but close to the same size. Warty skin. The one difference is if you look at the pigmentation of the color of the warts on their body, a Fowler's toad might have 3 or more warts in a little dark area on the body because they have more pattern. American toad on the upper left there, 1 or 2 warts. But they sometimes hybridize. But they do have a little certain different habits. Their calls are different. Fowler's toads usually breed a little later in the spring. They're more likely to use a more permanent body of water to lay the eggs. Their call is more kind of a wah sound, kind of more like a goat or sheep calling or something, whereas the American toad has a high-pitched trilling sound, you know. So very, very different. They look very similar to each other, but both are equally welcome in the garden and eat a lot of bugs. Here's two toads getting ready to lay eggs. You see eggs in the background. Toad eggs come out in long strings instead of big clumpy eggs like frogs do. They're actually in two long strings. Looks like black pearls that actually twist and go actually many yards long. And little toadlets, when they transform, they're very tiny, smaller than a penny. They'll grow very, very quickly. But even at that size, you see they have little parotoid glands on the back of their heads there. So even a small toad like that is somewhat toxic. And there's a little baby Fowler's toad ready to go. Okay, now I don't have a Fowler's toad this evening to show you, but I do have another American toad female. So I'm going to pass that around and let you look at her, and you can compare her to the other toads. So for the purpose of a gardener, not much difference, but for a naturalist like me, a big difference between a Fowler's toad and an American toad. All right, any questions about frogs and toads? We'll kind of sling into salamanders here for a moment and talk a little bit about them. Yes, Patrick?
I was real impressed. In fact, I got a video which I might find able to show you. We have a roller for rolling cover crops down, crimping and rolling them. And we went over a bunch of beds in the greenhouse, and then after we rolled them, the toads came up. And I was thinking, wow, we definitely don't have much pressure there.
Right, yeah.
But then we were working this year planting, and I found a toad, and it was in a little hole. Yeah. Perfectly camouflaged. Its head just at the soil level. So you think most of those guys were probably in little holes, and that's why we were able to roll over?
Right, yeah. Yeah, so they wouldn't get squashed because they were down under that and the pressure didn't get them. Yeah.
But still, if there'd been lots of pressure, we would have crushed the hole too. But,
Right, yeah. So if you want to encourage toads to be in a garden situation or something, like, the big thing is have a pool of water for them to lay their eggs in. It doesn't take much for that. But also, they need cover during the daytime, not only loose soil, but they need to get under something. So what you said is good, but people sometimes take things like flower pots, turn them on their side, and make what we call a toad abode, a little shelter, a rock that has a little cavity underneath it, boards lying down that have a little space underneath them. Anything like that that provides the shade and the moist area will attract toads to be able to hide during the daytime and then come out in the evening and hunt those bugs in the gardens. All right, we'll swing into salamanders. I mentioned that this area is known as the salamander capital of the world, and we don't think about salamanders as making as much of a difference in a garden situation as something like a frog or a toad because they're smaller, but they might make a difference, and they should be welcome just because of what they are. And amphibians are part of the food chain for many other animals. And if you have an abundance of any kind of amphibian, or particularly salamanders, on your land or your garden, you have some good conditions for whatever you're doing because they're very sensitive to environmental changes. So salamanders are like barometers in the world of animals because their skin is always wet and moist, and if water is unclean, if there's pollutants present, then they show it very quickly. So if salamanders disappear, that's a pretty bad sign. So in our mountain area here, we have a lot of mountain streams, springs, rocky little rills like this that hold a lot of salamanders, and a lot of people think of salamanders as living around those places, and they do. We have salamanders that they lay their little eggs under the rocks in these little places, little jelly-like eggs that hatch out. But a lot of those are what we call dusky salamanders. And they're that typical salamanders you go into the woods and flip over a rock, and it's a little brown, grayish creature that scurries away, and it's really hard to catch. We've got a few in a jar here. I'm going to pass these around as well. Mountain folks used to call these things spring lizards because they resemble a lizard, but a lizard is a reptile with dry, scaly skin. Amphibians have smooth, wet skin. Also, salamanders do not have claws on the tips of their toes. Lizards, which are reptiles, do have that. And their bodies are very smooth, wet. This particular type of salamander actually breathes through its skin, does not have lungs, believe it or not. Some salamander species do have lungs, but they do resemble lizards somewhat on the outer surface. So you can see why somebody might call them spring lizards at some point in time. But a lot of them in the mountains here. But if you have a little stream that comes through your garden or yard, you might have a few little dusky salamanders on there, particularly if it's kind of a cold water, shady little stream. Dusky salamander is a general term. It's like talking to somebody who knows a lot about birds and saying you saw a sparrow or you saw a warbler. Well, what species a warbler? What species a sparrow? A lot of those are very confusing, very hard to tell one from another. But if you go around a stream, you see a brownish little salamander, a few inches long, wiggling away. Chances are one of the many numerous species called dusky salamanders. They come in a few other color varieties as well. Some have a tendency to go on land a little bit more. They have really large bug eyes. Some go by certain names like the mountain dusky salamander. Here, there's others like this called the seal salamander. But all these are salamanders of streams, springs, wet little woodland wetlands like that. We have very cold, clear, clean water. But there are other salamander species that might turn up in a garden situation away from streams and places like that. But these that are shown here are the types that are typically associated with the mountain habitats, like say of springs, mountain creeks, branches, all those kinds of things. And you know, salamanders generally live around those rocks and places like that, but there's salamanders that live under stones, or salamanders that live under rotting logs, mossy logs, under big boulders, or salamanders that live underground. And we have some salamanders that are truly aquatic that live in our mountain streams, out in free-flowing swimming in the water. And some that are aquatic as adults that live in things like ponds and lakes, still water habitat too. Some of the more land-dwelling salamanders that you might see in a garden situation where you have something laying down like a board, a bucket, or something that you move, would be these guys, slimy salamanders, which are normally a woodland salamander, living under mossy logs and boulders. But any kind of ground debris near a wood's edge might attract a slimy salamander to be found underneath it. And like their name implies, they're actually very slimy and sticky. They have a skin glands that actually produces a mucousy material there that makes it hard for an animal to eat them, so it's a good protection for them. But most of these are woodland salamanders. Blue-ridged two-line salamander sometimes winds up in a garden, particularly after a rainy night or something when they kind of travel place to place. One that you might find a lot if you have some damp soil, and particularly if you do have a stream or even a pond or something like that associated with your property. This is an underground salamander that lives in wet channels under the ground. It's called a northern red salamander, about 5 or 6 inches long, bright reddish orange color, little black spots, absolutely gorgeous salamander. And if you ever see one of these guys, it's pretty notable. You'll see them not during the daytime though, at night on rainy nights moving around, or if you accidentally dig one up with your shovel out of the ground if it's damp soil. Also, they got a cousin called the mud salamander, which is equally beautiful. They look very much similar. The eye color is a little bit different in the mud salamander than it is in the northern red. But these are very subterranean salamanders that we occasionally dig up when you're doing plowing operations, digging up that sort of stuff in a garden. But there's another one that might also be present in your area, and you might not know it because it lives totally underground. And this is one of my favorites. It's called a spotted salamander. And spotted salamanders are very large, sometimes as much as 8 or 9 inches long, very big, thick body with yellow spots, black coloration, sometimes orange spots on their heads. And as you see from that picture there, they get quite large. A little bit easier to handle and look at. And these are kind of interesting because they're big enough and things they eat might make a little bit more of an impact to somebody who's gardening. And they're underground though, so the things they would be feeding on, the things they would find underground burrows as they tunnel under the surface. In a wild situation, it would use these vernal pools, woodland pools that would form in a woodland somewhere. And then it's about the same time of year as wood frogs arrive to lay their eggs in these little vernal pools. Spotted salamanders arrive as well from nearby areas on rainy nights. They're silent, they don't call for mates, they just show up, sometimes dozens at a time underneath the water. They lay these little packets. The males leave behind a little spermatophore package that the female picks up in her body, and then she lays these round egg masses that you don't easily see the individual embryos in there unless you look closely. This is a spotted salamander egg mass. Looks different than that of a frog egg mass. This is another look at one that's a little clearer to look into. And but they actually use vernal pools just like wood frogs. So if you put a vernal pool in and you have toads using that, and you might have wood frogs using it, sooner or later you might have spotted salamanders using it too if you had woodlands that surround your place where you live. So here's a spotted salamander. It's kind of a typical spotted salamander. We'll pass it around. And very beautiful. They get much bigger than that though. But definitely could turn up in your garden from time to time, but mostly an underground creature. But they're also great to have because if you have a vernal pool, their larvae hatch out and they are carnivorous. So if you do have those mosquito larvae or anything in a pool, they're going to eat them. So that's another good reason why you want to have them in a pool that's not moving water. Yes?
And if they're in the garden, would they be eating what?
Well, they're not going to be things above ground. Whatever's underground, they might encounter as they burrow underground. So some of your beetle grubs and things like that probably, yeah. And of course, you know, a lot of things are not just flying and crawling on the surface. Things get their start underground that affect the garden. So you know, have a little pest control underground naturally as well as above ground. Toads above ground doing it. Maybe spotted salamander, some other things like that underground.
How small will they eat?
How small will they eat?
Yeah.
They'll eat anything they can catch and put in their mouth if they're hungry. You know, so
would they bother with something the size of, let's say, a period?
probably.
Okay.
You know, if they're hungry enough. If it's just right there in front of them, they're probably
Give me a flea beetle eggs.
Yeah. And then if you also have a lot of times if somebody has a garden, you might have a pool or something where you draw water for irrigation or something like that. But if you have a kind of a permanent pool that stays year after year, even if you don't get fish in them, or even if you do, you might have these creatures here. So red-spotted newts are aquatic salamanders a few inches long that live in pools and ponds, and they will also eat mosquito larvae. So if you have an established pool like that, particularly if it's a foot or two deep, sooner or later red-spotted newts are probably going to colonize that, and they're also one of those predators that keeps insects under control. But they live that's an aquatic salamander as an adult. That's a male there. Here's a female. They're kind of greenish in color. Newts are salamanders, but they have a drier skin than most salamanders. And they're aquatic as adults, but they have a land stage that sometimes you'll find walking around in the woods or anywhere on dry land called the red eft. So that makes them a little different than other salamanders. Salamander eggs hatch in the water. They have a gill stage, and then they lose their gills. They go on land in the red spotted newt here. They have a land stage called the red eft, which is a little salamander, very red or orange color. It walks around on land 1 to 3 years, eating little bugs and things it encounters. Anything it can get in its mouth it will eat. Then it transforms. It goes back to water to live as an aquatic adult. So they have this extra land stage that most other salamanders do not have before they go back to the water. So red efts are commonly encountered walking around. They're bright red or orange in coloration. They're very toxic to other animals. So it's thought that that's a warning coloration that nobody should eat them because of that. They darken up as you get a little older, and then they return to the water as an aquatic adult. Yes?
So I was walking with some family once, and we interrupted the flight of a red eft from a snake. And that snake grabbed it. Now, did it eventually not eat it? Or?
Well, it depends what kind of snake it was. Some snakes can eat things like that. So if maybe it was a garter snake, it might have been able to ingest it because garter snakes can eat toads. And toads are toxic to a lot of other animals.
It could well have been a garter snake. My memory was it was not a snake that really fascinated me like I'd seen it before.
Right, yeah. So snakes, might get your attention a little bit more than an amphibian. Most people aren't going to try to eradicate toads or frogs from their garden. They know they're pretty harmless and that they eat insects. But when it comes to snakes, a lot of people are afraid of snakes. Let's face it. And a lot of that is because of the fact that some snakes are venomous, But around our area here in the western North Carolina area where we're at right here, only 2 species of snakes are venomous. We'll talk more about those a little bit later here. But snakes should be encouraged, actually, to be around a garden situation because some snakes will eat insects, but most don't. But most snakes do eat the furry rodents. So whether it's a mouse, a vole, or anything like that, those kind of creatures, rodents, can cause a lot of damage. And many of the snakes, particularly the larger snakes, are rodent eaters. And they're the most efficient rodent eaters they are because they can go anywhere a rodent can go. Owls eat mice and rats and voles and things like that, but can an owl go down a hole that big in the ground? No. People keep cats around to catch rodents. Can a cat go in a hole? No. But a snake, can it go in a hole that big? Yes, it can. It can go right down anywhere a rat or mouse can go, a snake can go, and it can catch the adult, it can catch the babies and clean out the whole nest. So snakes are the most efficient predators of rodents that you can possibly have. If you just get over your fear of them and realize that they are so efficient, and I've learned that over the years about how efficient they are. I could tell you a few stories. But snakes are amazing on what they can do and what they eat and where they can go. So Snakes do like sunny habitat, but that includes places like gardens. And we put our gardens in sunny areas where the plants can grow. They don't like to be out in the sun all the time. They like those brushy edges and places like that where they can seek shelter, but also the rodents and things that they may feed on. But sunny, open areas, because snakes are cold-blooded creatures that generally want to be warm. They have to move into the sunshine to get warm. They move into the shade to get cool. Overgrown areas along woods edges and power lines and anything like that would attract them, but that could also be your yard edge and a woods edge, particularly some kind of debris that's there, rock piles, rock walls, anything like that that provides ground debris will provide a habitat for snakes. Sometimes the only thing that you know that a snake has been around is because you see where it's actually been because it shed its skin. So snakes shed their skin. That's a pretty magical thing. Most animals don't shed their skin in one entire piece like that, but because they do, that makes them very, very unusual. Ancient people used to think that snakes live forever because when they shed their skin, they look brand new. So that's a pretty cool thing that snakes can do. And if you know a little bit about shed snake skin, you find one in the garden, you can actually identify what kind of snake it is, because a pattern is left behind that skin. Not color, but pattern is left. Yes?
About
How long does it live?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on snakes. Some snakes, like garter snakes, which are really common in gardens, 4 or 5 years on average maybe. Other snakes like rat snakes, which are rodent eaters, 15 or 20 years sometimes. So they have different lifespans depending on what kind of a snake they are. But we have about 20 species of non-venomous snakes in our area, in the mountain areas here. Only 2 venomous species, though, okay? Only 2 venomous species, so we'll talk about those. We're not going to mention all 20. I'm just going to mention a few that would be most likely to turn up in a garden situation that might concern people. And some of these are snakes that you may have never even heard of, but you might, because gardeners do things that other people don't. Gardeners get down on the ground. Gardeners dig in the earth. Gardeners weed things. You dig things. You pull things. You turn over things. You know, you're in contact with the earth, and when you're doing that, you're going to see things that maybe other people don't get to see, which is a good thing. So, but one of the ones that you might come across is something called an eastern worm snake. Eastern worm snakes look like a worm. They're about the size of a big night crawler, and they actually eat worms as well. Here's a typical worm snake next to a penny on a rock. That's about the average size. They're very glossy, kind of pinkish like a worm, you know, and totally harmless, not venomous whatsoever. Don't even bite, but they're a burrowing snake. So you'll find them under a rock, or if you're digging up the earth, you'll find them in the loose earth itself. So gardeners are people that find worm snakes. Very small, very harmless, very shiny, a very beautiful little snake, but totally not dangerous. There's no venom, nothing there. But they eat earthworms. So being that earthworms are the gardener's friend, I don't know if we say that we want to encourage worm snakes because they eat earthworms, but worm snakes are so small, they're not going to be a problem eating a few earthworms here and there, because earthworms are very bountiful and numerous. So an earthworm would not, just because of what it eats, does not mean it's a bad character hound. But it might also eat some things like little grubs and other insects and things like that. So it might deviate from its earthworm diet from time to time. But definitely something that you don't have to worry about in the garden. And personally, I like to see it in the garden. Ringneck snakes are something that we often find because they're also one of these little ground-dwelling snakes that are found under ground debris. And they'll eat various things. Sometimes they'll eat salamanders, sometimes they'll eat small amphibians, but they might also eat some insects, also things like spiders from time to time, beetle grubs, that sort of thing. So their diet is varied. Totally harmless snake, but they actually do have a little ring around their neck. This is a really big, huge one, about 18 inches long. Usually they're more like a foot long, very tiny little snakes. They have a bright underneath of their body there, bright kind of a yellowish orange with a tiny little ring around their neck. Totally harmless little snake, almost never bites. If it did, its teeth are so small you couldn't even feel it. They often flip the bottom of their body up, giving you a light undersurface as a bright coloration to kind of frighten away an enemy, which is kind of interesting. They have a cousin called the red-bellied snake, which looks very similar, but instead of being kind of a yellowish underneath, it does have a bright orange belly, but it has a little bit of a ring around the neck, so to speak, just a little bit, so it can easily be misidentified. But you see it's a very, very small snake as well. So once again, these are snakes that are usually under a foot in length that we sometimes dig up in a garden. Surprisingly enough, this snake called the northern brown snake turns up more in a rural type garden or a vacant lot in a city more than it does in the countryside. And these guys are probably would be great for a garden because they eat, one of their favorite foods are slugs. I don't think any gardener likes slugs because what slugs feed on, plants. So you know, slugs can do a lot of damage. So if you have slugs, let's hope that you get blessed with northern brown snakes, which usually average about a foot or so in length or less, fat body, but very nondescript pattern, kind of a grayish brown with small dots. This is one of the snakes that will be really hard to describe to somebody, you know, if you're trying to get an identification of a snake over the phone. But the fact that they eat slugs is a very, very good thing, and often found in more urban situations than actually in the wild. So that's a definite plus in the garden. And they like to live in little underground burrows as well, but come to the surface to feed on other things that they may find, like the slugs. Probably more than any other snake that people find around gardens and situations close to people where we do what we do are garter snakes. And almost everybody's heard of a garter snake, which a lot of people call a garden snake, which is not the true name. It's garter snake. Named for the long stripes on the body is what garters used to look like a long time ago when people used to wear garters. But most people think they could easily identify a garter snake with this big long stripes, but they don't always have stripes on their body. So garter snakes come in a bewildering variety of patterns and colors. So we're going to look at a few of these, and you may say, oh, that was a garter snake I saw, but I didn't realize they were so variable. So there's a good textbook example with a nice stripe going down its middle of his body. Here's an even better textbook example, very bright stripe. That's even yellowish. But notice, like if we back up, this one between the stripes, it has a lot of pattern, and the stripe is not bright yellow. This one is bright yellow, but the pattern between this stripe is very dark. But that's still the eastern garter snake. Here's a garter snake that has very little striping at all. Also showing about the average size of most of these snakes. But these guys prey on a lot of different things in the garden, including insects that you might not like to have around. They've been known to eat small rodents as well. If they're frightened by something, they will puff their body up. This one's actually puffing up his body, and between the scales there, you see little little rectangular markings suddenly showing up, and then a little space in between that. Many snakes swell their bodies, inflate themselves with the air, revealing patterns between the scales that you normally wouldn't see, and that makes their color and pattern totally change, makes them look twice as large as they are, even sometimes flatten their heads so they're very wide and triangular, making themselves look like a venomous snake. So that scares a lot of people. Garter snakes can do all that sort of thing, and so they scare a lot of people, and a lot of garter snakes get killed thinking that there's some kind of a venomous snake. Here's two garter snakes that come from the same mother. Garter snakes give birth to live young. Many snakes lay eggs. But these are two from the same litter, and look at the pattern, how different it is from the one on the left and one on the right. So they're very variable. Here's these two more. One on the left there has stripes down its body, the one on the other has more blotching, but that's from the same litter of snakes. And typically when the garter snakes are young, they have more of that blotching than they do the stripe on their back. Our venomous snakes that we have in our mountains here, they give live birth. Things like water snakes, which are not venomous, they give live birth. Garter snakes give live birth, but many others are egg layers. So it's kind of half and half. But if you do find an egg from a snake in our area here, or anywhere in North America except where you might find the coral snake, which is a venomous snake that lays eggs, if there's eggs, you know it's a harmless snake. Let's put it that way. So you're not going to find rattlesnake eggs, copperhead eggs, or anything like that because they give live birth. So when people see eggs, snake eggs, that scares them a lot of times. Is this something venomous, you know? And it's not. So garter snake, around a garden quite a bit. Variable coloration and pattern, and they can turn up just about anywhere. So maybe we should call them the garden snake rather than a garter snake. Might be a good name change here. Northern black racer, we're getting a little bit larger snakes here. Black racers you may observe around an open space, anywhere you're gardening or where it's sunny, because they like to feed on a lot of rodents and things that hang around brushy areas. These guys hunt mostly during the daytime though, and some snakes come out at night. A lot of rodents are active at night, but these snakes can find some things during the daytime. But they're kind of interesting because they have a way of prowling during sunny areas, and they actually will hold their head up like a periscope and kind of lay their head parallel to the ground, and sometimes actually crawl a short distance with their head held up like that. There's no other snake around there that does that. Some other snakes may stretch their neck out trying to reach to a branch or something to climb, but these snakes do it to look up above vegetation and hold their head and literally sometimes crawl with their head held even parallel to the ground with the forward part of their body held up. So a very interesting snake indeed. But these snakes are ground-dwelling snakes, but they can escape if they're frightened up into low brush and low tree limbs, but they have to just kind of loop their body around things like that. They're not a really good climbing snake like some other species are. But we occasionally see them, and they're very fast, very nervous snakes, and you can't usually ever get very close to them. But you might find their eggs, and this is the big thing about gardeners. If you're a gardener, chances are you have a compost pile. Chances are you have a mulch pile, something like that. And what is mulch or compost? Is decaying vegetation. It creates heat, and that's exactly where snakes like to lay their eggs. Snakes do not make nests like birds do. They lay their eggs in a rotting stump, some kind of decaying vegetation, let the heat of the decaying vegetation, the moisture is built up there, hatch their eggs. Their eggs don't have a brittle shell. It's got a permeable membrane, so it absorbs moisture or loses moisture. So they lay them in these moist compost, rotting heaps of stuff. And if they lay it near your house, you know, that's maybe what the kind of thing they find, that compost heap or that mulch pile. So you may be digging in there and find snake eggs. And if they're kind of rounded like this, about this size, and you look at them very close, they have little raised bumps or little granules on them. They probably come from a black racer. That's the kind of eggs they lay. And when they hatch, here's a little black racer hatching out of an egg. They do not look like the adult. And you know, when you're a gardener, you often find baby snakes because you're near where the eggs have been laid. And if you saw that baby snake, most people think that was a baby copperhead, which it really doesn't resemble. But you might not realize it's going to be solid black in a couple of years. It looks dangerous, and it's got a pattern on there. And many people get fooled by baby snakes, which will actually change as they get older. So don't let baby snakes fool you. A lot of times they look like something dangerous, and they're not. So that's a baby black racer. The snake we see the most around our area here around garden situations because it loves to come out and sun itself and be around anywhere where woods meets a garden edge or something like that, because that's a rich zone where a lot of animals live, including rodents, and then also they get sunshine there. And it's this guy called the black rat snake. Black rat snakes can get to be 6 feet long or more, averaging about 4 or 5 feet. Usually pretty much solid black when they're full grown, but when they're younger, they have a pattern, just like a baby black racer. Here's a typical looking black rat snake, very shiny, black in color. They look a little bit like a black racer, but they actually have a raised ridge on each of their scales, which a black racer does not have. And black rat snakes can actually have these little checkerboard patterns on underneath of their body and a little whitish pattern on the first third of the body, where a black racer only has a white chin and doesn't have a pattern on the belly. Also, a black rat snake can climb up the bark of a tree in an S shape. Black racer cannot do that. So if you see a snake with all those characteristics, it's probably a black rat snake, and they're really, really commonly seen in our area here in the mountains. And if you see them lying out on the ground sunning themselves, they have a very unusual method of kinking their body, so it almost looks like their back is broken. But they kink it, and it's thought that by lying there looking kinked up, it's actually a bit of a camouflaging effect. It almost looks like a crooked stick lying on the ground. But as soon as you disturb them, then they slowly crawl away. But that's a very distinctive thing that rat snakes do. This is called the black rat snake, but there are many other different kinds of rat snakes around. But the black rat is the one we have the most here. They are very adept at climbing. And even though they eat a lot of rodents, and they're a good thing to have in your garden, they do have the fact that they will eat whatever's available, which means they can climb and get into bird houses. So if you put a birdhouse out on a tree, don't be surprised if you go up there one day and a snake is sticking his head out and he's eating all the little birds, either the eggs or the babies or whatever. But if you don't want that to happen, put your birdhouse on a pole, a slick pole, put a predator guard or something on it so a snake can't climb up to it. But don't get mad at a snake eating a few birds, because they eat a lot more rodents and make up for that by eating more rodents than anything else. So they're just opportunistic. but they can't get up there. But they scare a lot of people because they are variable in their color. They have a behavior that makes them look like a rattlesnake. This one I encountered on my way to get my morning paper one day in my driveway. Notice his head is flattened so it looks triangular. You can't tell right now, but he's hissing very loudly. He's coiled back in a defensive pose. He's inflated his body with air, revealing patterns that you normally wouldn't see because the rest of his body is kind of black in color there. And somebody seeing that would think that was some kind of a rattlesnake. In fact, he's actually vibrating and rattling his tail like a rattlesnake would do. So rat snakes are very good at making a defensive posture and looking like they're very, very dangerous. They lay a smooth egg, but it's very large, also in compost heaps, mulch piles, or rotting logs. So probably more than anything else, gardeners find black rat snake eggs when they go through a pile of material. They usually lay their eggs sometime in, say, usually late May, early June, something like that. They hatch out in August and September usually. When they're getting ready to hatch, they start to split. Little snakes have a little egg tooth. They slit the egg and they emerge and they have a blotched pattern. And many people have seen these little babies and say, oh my goodness, I killed that thing. It was a baby rattlesnake, baby copperhead, something like that. But they don't look like the adult at all. They've got a light gray background with darker gray or blackish blotches and spots. And they hiss, they rattle their tails, they flatten their heads and inflate their bodies with air. They have to be very defensive because at this age they're only about the size of a really big earthworm, about 10 inches long, 8 inches long rather, and many things can eat them. So many of them are killed by people thinking that there's something harmful when they're babies, but leave them alone, they'll grow up to be big and big rodent eaters, and very efficient rodent eaters as that.
So Carlton, if we're working a pile and we find those eggs, but we plan on taking the pile away, what's the kindest thing we can do to those eggs?
Leave a little pile with them in it, probably, or call somebody like me to come rescue the eggs. And then I can hatch those and then release the babies later.
The pile probably wouldn't be big enough to not dry out if it wasn't raining much yet.
Right, yeah. And also the eggs, if they're turned over, if it's very late in the cycle, the oxygen content in the eggs can be disturbed and it could kill the babies in there too. So, yeah.
Try not to disturb.
So you don't want to rotate the eggs. If you were to ever collect snake eggs, you want to collect them and keep sometimes people will even put an X on it. Collect it, put it in a container, some damp paper towels or soil or something like that, but you don't want to rotate them because that can disturb that balance in there.
So if we had a pile we were moving and we found them in the pile, we could put a little X on them and then move them to another pile and put them in that pile, that'd be fine.
Right, you could do that, yeah. We don't have these very often in the mountains, but I always like to mention it because there are in other places in North Carolina, something called the red rat snake. The other was the black rat snake. This is a cousin of the black rat snake, also sometimes referred to as a corn snake, which is a popular snake as a pet, believe it or not. Many of them are very bright like this, depending on what geographic region they come from. But they're very variable, but very pretty with a lot of browns and reds and oranges on there, making people sometimes think that they're venomous snakes like copperheads. Highly variable depending on the area they come from. A lot of them that come from North Carolina or the mountain region here or anywhere, they're darker in color. They have bright reddish blotches, but the background color ends up being more of a kind of a grayish green, but still a very pretty snake. There's a little close-up of the pattern there. And a rodent eater as well. They also have that same habit of kinking up. This is one I photographed on a highway that I rescued before a car was able to hit him, but it's just very hard to see when it's kinked up like that. It just blends into the surrounding pattern and probably is a defensive thing. Also, we have, some people see eastern king snakes from time to time, which they sometimes mistake for black rat snakes. King snakes are not the most common snake in this part of the world up here in our mountains, but you get down in lower areas, they are more common. Sometimes called the chain king snake because of the pattern they have on them, but kind of a black snake with a chain-like pattern of yellow or whitish on them. These snakes are great mousers. They're very, very beneficial to have in a garden situation. The only bad thing is they'll eat things that you might want to have in a garden situation as well, including other king snakes. They are cannibals. They'll eat any other snake species. They'll eat their own snake species sometimes. But they also are known for actually feeding on venomous snake species. So they're actually immune to the bites of our venomous native snakes, but they don't kill something and eat something that's too big for them to swallow. But believe it or not, a king snake, and I've seen this happen, they can eat a snake the same size they are, believe it or not. And there's one eating a garter snake. So they eat both the good, the bad, and the ugly, but they're considered to be a very, very beneficial snake to have around. And if you have a king snake around, you might not have many other species of snakes. So, but most people appreciate a king snake because they are a very good rodent eater. A cousin of a king snake that we see sometimes is the eastern milk snake. It's actually a type of king snake, but notice it has a reddish color. People mistake that for a copperhead. Anything that has red or brown on it, people think are copperheads. But this is actually a species of king snake, smaller and thinner, but they're variable. That snake right there doesn't really look like that snake, does it? But they're both eastern milk snakes. So, you know, when you get to know your snakes, you got to realize that patterns can change from young to old. Just within the species, there's variation, just like there's variation within humans, you know, from young to old or from adult to adult. So that's one of the big things. People get confused about snakes because they're so hard for the average person to identify. But the fact is, most of the snakes you see are harmless lookalikes if you think you're seeing something venomous. So there's your eastern milk snake, and unfortunately, a lot of them get killed. They're actually very, very beautiful snakes. And there's another one with a slightly different pattern as well. So get to know your snakes and all their different colors and patterns. Here's one with a similar pattern at first. It's kind of reddish looking, and it looks kind of similar. I'll go back and forth for a second. But this one is much fatter body. But this one is usually found around the water. It's called the northern water snake. And northern water snakes are highly variable, but this is one that everybody thinks is a water moccasin or venomous cottonmouth when you see it in the water. In western North Carolina, we do not have venomous water snakes. We don't have what's called the water moccasin or cottonmouth. We have plenty of northern water snakes. This is an exceptionally brightly colored one. He's wet. His colors are shining in the sun, so he's got banding on there. It looks very maroon and reddish. Looks very copperhead looking. This is also a northern water snake. His colors are dry and muted because he's up there lying on the bank, and he's not wet, but they can be that dull in color. So look at the difference. How bright that is, how dull that is, but it's the same species of snake. And then this is the same species of snake too. This is nice and brown. He's been drying out in the sun. He's sitting in the bottom of a waterfall, but he's a little bit, just the coloration he has is just, he has a lot of dark color in it. He might also be one that's getting ready to shed, and they dull up right before they shed their skin. But that is the same snake as that. I mean, you wouldn't think it, but just show you how variable they are. No wonder people have trouble identifying snakes. Here's a very old female northern water snake. When they get very old, sometimes their pattern gets lost as they mature and dull out, and they won't even have a pattern at all. But look how fat the snake looks. It looks like the big head. And most people think venomous snakes have these big, huge heads, which sometimes they do, but not always. So many of these snakes get killed. People see these because anywhere there's water, you see water snakes, and they often go away from water as well. So just because you don't have any water right there doesn't mean you can't see a water snake in your yard or garden. Here's one that's agitated. He's flattening his head out, so it's kind of triangular. He's puffing his body up with air. The head gets very triangular looking. They'll coil, they'll strike for all the world, and you would swear that was some kind of a venomous snake. But once again, it's a harmless snake, but it has a bite that hurts, you know, so you don't want to handle a water snake. But so many of these get killed thinking that they're something venomous because they're so good at not only looking like something venomous, but behaving like something venomous. Actually, most of our venomous snakes actually don't behave the way this snake does. Most of our venomous snakes actually just are very quiet and demure and don't go into such a hissy as something like this is trying to scare you away, thinking that it's actually dangerous. Here's a water snake swimming in the water. And you notice his colors are very bright there and shiny, you know, but that's still the same species, northern water snake, a harmless, non-venomous snake. And here's a baby one. And they do not hatch from eggs, they are born alive. And when they're small like this, sometimes the color is a little more dull, but they have that pattern and banding that's typical of the adults. Eyes may be a little bit bigger, you know. But once again, people see the babies, and that looks a lot like a baby black rat snake or a baby black racer. You know, many of the baby snakes resemble each other. So what is venom? Okay, go ahead.
Could they be totally submerged in the water, or do they just swim on top?
They can go underwater. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of times they swim on the water like that. but anytime they can dive underwater and disappear and come up. So we got 2 species of snakes we'll talk about here, and then we'll be done. And then we'll break out a couple of snakes if anybody wants to visit with a snake or two, including a nice, friendly, non-venomous snake. But we also have a venomous snake to show you, a live one. But there's only 2 venomous snakes found in the mountains here where we're talking about. But if you go into other parts of North Carolina, there are other species. So venomous snakes are geographically separated based on elevation, mountains, stuff, all that kind of stuff. So here in North Carolina, we actually do have venomous water snakes called the cottonmouth or water moccasin, but not in the mountain region. They're in the eastern part of the state. So, but we don't have them in the mountains because they like warm water, swampy type areas, and it's too cool up here. But we have 2 species of venomous snakes here in West North Carolina. The one that we most commonly see is called the northern copperhead. And this is an upland or mountain type of copperhead. There is actually a southern copperhead that lives in the lowlands of the southeast United States. But this snake, as you can tell, it looks a lot like the water snake pattern at first. You know, so there are many snakes that resemble each other in patterns and that sort of stuff. But if you put them side by side and start to study them, you'll see there's all kinds of differences. So northern copperhead often does have a coppery colored head, but the body pattern is almost always an hourglass or saddlebag type marking pattern with a lighter background, but that's highly variable. The background color can be darker or lighter depending on where they're at. And sometimes the head is not coppery colored at all, but much darker. So that's a typical northern copperhead. Here, just for comparison, here's a typical northern water snake that we were just talking about on the upper left with this pattern and his head. Here's a copperhead down on the lower right. You put them side by side, there's a world of differences when you look at them. But when you see that quick glimpse of that thing in your garden or in the woods or the edge of the water, you're not so sure. You know, so it's good to know these things ahead of time. Notice the copperhead has some great camouflage, blends in really well. And a lot of times they're lying still on the forest floor, and that's how bites occur. People step on them or put their hands on them by accident. But they're not very prone to bite unless you actually put your hands on them. They're actually very shy. Some are a little like this one's kind of a bit more of a purplish tone to their coloration. Notice they actually do have slit-like pupils. Most people think that venomous snakes always have slit-like, cat-like pupils. All what we call the pit vipers, which are snakes, all the venomous snakes in North America, with the exception of the coral snake, which is a snake that has bright colors of red, yellow, and black, that's found around Florida and Georgia and places like that, which is a very uncommon snake. It has round pupils, and this is actually a member of the cobra family, believe it or not. All the other ones are what we call pit vipers in this country, and they all the pit vipers do have that slit-like pupil. They also have an extra heat-sensitive pit on the side of the face, where they take heat from warm-blooded prey between their eye and their nostril. It's a little harder to see on this snake here, but it's right in front of the eye. But that pupil can open up into a big round pupil in dim light. So don't count on the pupil always being small like that. That is in bright light, but it is a characteristic of pit vipers. Notice how well it blends in. This snake is also disturbed. It's puffing its body up with air, moving its head. Before that, its head was down, and you could barely see it in the leaves there. So they've got great camouflage, and you may step right next to one many times and never be bitten, never know it was there, because they don't want to bite. They just want to be left alone. They come out and sun themselves. This is a big female about to give birth to live young. Captured out of somebody's garden. So you know people have gardens where they grow crops and vegetables and all, but they also have flower gardens and places where they grow ornamentals. This is in somebody's ornamental flower garden, and if you have rocks, if you have ground debris, anything like that, that provides a place for them to hide. They love rock walls. They love landscape timbers and anything like that or any kind of a place that they get behind, because rodents can live there, which is one of their primary foods. So these guys actually help you by eating rodents. But they're actually not something you want to encourage in the garden, but if you find one, you don't want to harm them. They're very shy, and unless you put your hands right on one, you're not going to get bit.
So this is a big one. What is a big one? How big is a big one?
A big one for around here will be about a 3-footer. Most of them are 2 feet or less, but a 2-foot copperhead can be a very fat copperhead, but a 3-foot copperhead, is a really big copperhead for around here, But notice how much darker this one is than some of the other ones there. So they're really variable. This is one I encountered in one of the nearby national forests one morning, about 9 in the morning. I was actually out with a school group and just crossing a path, And notice how it's got a color of brick red. This was a really big one. This was probably closer to 4 feet. This was one of the biggest I've seen in the area here in the mountains. But very shy, you know. I lifted this one up out of the path with a stick and put it off to one side. You know, there's no need to kill these snakes when they're encountered. If you see one, chances are you won't see it again, you know. But they actually are very common, and maybe one of our more common snakes, but I always say they're very common but very uncommonly encountered because they come out mostly at night, particularly in the summertime. They're actually more of a nocturnal hunter, and during the daytime they're going to be close to very thick cover and only travel abroad at night, which brings to mind that if you like to walk around in your yard or garden at night, watch out because that's when they're on the move. And they might actually be out in grassy lawns and things as they search for rodents and things, traveling one point to another. So sometimes I shudder when I go around in the summertime at campgrounds. I see people walk around at night barefooted, you know, from campsite to campsite. I say, oh, mercy. You know, they're tempting fate because that's when copperheads are active, you know. But you very seldom hear about a copperhead bite.
So for safety at nighttime if you're out, you should wear like high boots?
Well, at least carry a flashlight and shine it where you're walking. They also come out and sun themselves on rocks or pavement in the evening, so a lot of them get hit by cars a lot of times on the road. So they love to lie on anything that's picked up heat from the sun. But moving around at night on warm summer nights, always look where you're stepping because that's when they're active. And you could probably do that for most of your life and never step on one, but you might because that's when they are most active. So, but here's just to show you how different they can be. This is a southern copperhead from the lowland area, like in South Carolina. It has the same basic pattern, but the light areas of the background are much lighter. So that's how variable that's what we call a southern copperhead. That's a northern copperhead from the mountainous region, southern copperhead from the lowlands. The pattern remains somewhat similar, but the coloration can be strikingly different. So. And baby copperheads, you know, people are always seeing baby snakes and they're always afraid of the baby snake. Is this a baby copperhead? Baby copperhead. Baby copperheads just look exactly like the adults with one difference. Look closely, you'll see they have a bright yellow-green tail tip, as if it was dipped in paint. That's a newborn copperhead. Very distinctive. They actually wiggle that. It looks like a little worm. A salamander, a frog comes up to grab what they think is a worm. The little baby copperhead gets him a meal. But they have that for about the first year of their life and then it fades. But other than that, look at their pattern. They look just like the adult. So if it doesn't have a yellow-green tail tip, then it's not a baby copperhead. There's one that's a little bit older. It's got the little tail tip starting to fade a little bit. But that disappears within about a year. So when a copperhead gets about that long, no more yellow-green tail tip. And remember, copperheads like to hide during the day, active at night, but where do they hide? They hide under rock edges, rock piles, rock walls, anything they can get behind, get a little sun, but also escape if they need to. So wherever you go, you might find copperheads hiding around the edge of a rock during daylight hours. So just be careful, but unless you put your hand right on them, you're not going to get bit. But copperhead is a pretty common snake, actually. By the way, if you are bitten, you're in luck because very few bites, fatalities have ever been recorded from copperheads. Only a couple within modern history, within the past 50 years or so. People that are bitten by copperhead almost never die. That doesn't mean this can't be a serious bite, a very painful bite, not a fun bite, but you're probably going to be just fine. But you might have some lasting damage, so don't play with copperheads. But don't kill them either. So
if you think you're bit by one, do you go to the emergency room?
Yes.
But they don't give you antivenom?
Don't let them give you antivenom because you'll go home with probably a $100,000 hospital bill and an unnecessary treatment. There's more supportive treatment, and antivenom is usually given should only be given to victims of snake bite where you have a chance of dying, basically, like a rattlesnake bite. So the other snake we have around here, and we'll be closing here after this, timber rattlesnake. Usually no more than about 4.5 feet in length, but they're very fat. Most exciting of our venomous snakes, very big fat snake, obviously a snake that rattles its tail, even though many harmless snakes rattle their tails in an attempt to mimic that of a venomous snake. They come in two different basic color varieties, what we call the light phase or yellow phase, as this one is, with little black or brownish cross bands on their body, black tail, rattle, shaking there. On this snake, you can see the pits very well in front of the eyes. There's 2 forward-facing heat-sensitive pits, which picks up heat from warm-blooded animals that they hunt. So they can go up under a crevice of a rock or burrow and detect the heat change and know that there's a rodent down there that they can feed on or not. And it just helps them locate not only places to find food that they need to feed on, but helps them probably choose basking areas because they're a cold-blooded creature and they got to be very careful about the temperature where they're at. So it's an amazing feature that they have. But as frightening as a rattlesnake looks, this was in a defensive coil rattling because he's afraid. Generally speaking, you walk up on a rattlesnake, even if they're in a coil like that, they're laying very still and quiet. They don't rattle, they don't move unless you disturb them. So you may be standing right next to a rattlesnake and never know it, and he never strikes. So very, very shy snakes, and bites are few. But if you hang around rocky areas like that, that's typical rattlesnake habitat. That's where they like to go to den in the winter, and you can find snakes like that at any time of the year around rocks and all. But in the summertime, they move away from these dens, and they can be found literally just about anywhere. Whether it's in a forest, going through an open field, crossing a highway. If you have a garden area near the woods where rattlesnakes are known to occur, they like to come out and sun themselves on the forest edge. We see them a lot of times when they're moving to their dens, migrating in the spring away from the dens, in the fall back towards their winter dens, because they have specific dens, rocky dens they go underground to spend the winter. And if you're on one of those passageways, you may occasionally see a rattlesnake. But other than that, it's just kind of a chance occurrence when you see a rattlesnake. Here's another light phase rattlesnake, but notice he's got a lot more brown and not so much yellow in him. Here's a black phase, or dark phase we call it. Some of them can be almost solid black in color, and the brownish areas are replaced by black. And just for fun, we'll put a black rat snake up here that we saw earlier, and look how much he may resemble that at quick glance. If somebody saw that, or they saw this, and this snake was rattling its tail, and you can't tell there's not a rattle there, but he's in a defensive coil. He's got a pattern that's showing because his scales are spread apart. You could easily see why somebody would mistake this for a dark phase timber rattlesnake. So it happens a lot. And there they are side by side. So rattlesnakes actually are very shy. They do have a bite that's much more dangerous. People have died from the bites of rattlesnakes, but you hear about a lot more copperhead bites, which are much more common around people than you do rattlesnake bites. And most people survive rattlesnake bites as well, and they're pretty rare. And rattlesnakes are gorgeous animals, and they're becoming very rare in a lot of areas. And actually, in many states in the east here, timber rattlesnakes are on the endangered species or threatened species list. In North Carolina, you are not allowed to collect them from the wild, but if you feel like your life is threatened, you still have the right to kill one, which is crazy because the only way a rattlesnake threatens your life is if you pick it up and handle it, or jump up and down on it or something like that. Then it's going to bite you, and what wouldn't, you know? So unfortunately, it's hard sometimes to enact legislation to protect venomous snakes. But timber rattlesnakes, even though their potential for a dangerous bite is there, you'd be surprised at a number of these snakes that do live where people are sometimes, and we never see them. And these are big rodent eaters. You know, that snake eats a lot of rodents. So you don't want to encourage rattlesnakes to be in your garden, around your home, but you definitely do not want to kill them or harm them as well. And
sizes, what average?
Average about 3 feet or less, but that's a fat snake. 4.5 feet is about maximum. You hear tales of 6-footers, that's probably exaggerated. But you know, some have been known to get over 5 feet, but one that's 5 feet or bigger is a really big snake that could be as big around as your arm. So they can get really fat. And they,
I was hiking in Pennsylvania one time. I heard a sound that startled me, and I was trying to figure out what it was. As I got yanked backwards 3 feet by my sister, and there was one that was like huge crossing the road, and I thought it had to be a diamondback because it was so big.
Right, yeah.
It was up in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania, just a big timber rattler.
yeah, and that's a big thing. I'm glad you mentioned that, Patrick, because you know, these rattlesnakes are so variable in their pattern. It seems like no two you see look exactly like that. It could be the light phase, it could be the dark phase, but there's a lot of variations in those two color phases. And people have heard of diamondback rattlesnakes. They're famous. We do not have them in the western part of the state here. Eastern diamondback is found in the southeast United States, very rarely in eastern North Carolina, South Carolina and Georgia, a little more common in Florida, other places, but they're becoming very rare in the wild. But eastern diamondbacks superficially resemble the black phase timber rattlesnake here. I don't have a picture to show you the comparison, but they look a lot like that, so that's probably why people think we have diamondbacks here, because they're mistaking it for the black phase timber rattlesnake. But no eastern diamondbacks in western North Carolina whatsoever. And all rattlesnakes, of course, they have these rattle segments that actually shake. They're interlocking, they're loose, they're made of keratin like your fingernail material, but where the arrow is pointing, that's a new rattle segment forming. When they shed their skin, they add a new rattle segment at the base, but eventually they have them tear off and break off at the tip, and they shed their skin several times a year, usually, so you cannot tell the age of a rattlesnake by counting its number of rattles. It just shows you how many rattles he has since the last time some of them broke off, you know. But even an old rattlesnake probably sheds its skin at least a couple of times a year, and baby rattlesnakes maybe a half a dozen or more. So, snakes in the garden, you're probably not going to see rattlesnakes too often, but copperheads for sure. A lot of these other harmless snakes, you know, but chances are it probably is going to be a harmless snake of one sort or another. So don't panic if you see a snake. It's probably a good thing. If you have a question, call somebody like me. Have a good guidebook available. Worst thing you can do is kill a snake and ask questions about what it was later. You know, so snakes are generally not a threat in the garden. Even if it's a venomous snake, you probably wouldn't see that snake again. But if you don't want snakes in the garden, clean up the garden. Get rid of piles of wood, get rid of piles of rocks. Make your garden as clean and sterile and barren of any ground debris or anything like that, and just perfectly mulched and no weeds or anything, and you'll have less chance of having snakes. But then you'll have a less interesting garden, I think, as well. So with that said, that's what I'll do. If anybody like to, I've got a copperhead I'd like to show some folks here. I'm going to take it actually on a stick and show it to you on a snake hook so you can see what it looks like. And then we have a nice, friendly black rat snake that would be willing to visit with anybody who would like to get to know a black rat snake a little bit better and actually touch and handle it a little bit. So I'll pull out our copperhead here.
One last question.
And I'll take some questions while I'm doing this if you like. Go ahead.
Den fidelity. If you find, like when I was working at Mountain Air Garden, of course, the one time we found the copperhead was the night we were having a dinner in the garden. And so we did move that copperhead.
Right.
And the person who helped move it is a naturalist who works there, and she said she could move it pretty far because she knew that there would be good denning habitat.
Right.
Is it true that if you move to a place where there's good denning habitat, they'll be fine?
Probably. It depends on the kind of snake. You know, some people think that moving any snake or any animal away from where you found it is a death sentence, but copperheads, I think, are a little bit more prone to be adaptable because they, you know, I've seen them where they hibernate in stump holes or other places, so even though they often have dens where they go back, they're probably not as set on a specific den as something like a rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes are pretty much been studied a lot, and they almost always go back to the same den where they came from. The mothers give birth very close to the den. They lock in on that, they imprint on that den site, and they go back and forth, you know, for the rest of their life. And rattlesnakes live a long time. In a while, rattlesnakes have been known to live well over 20 years, in captivity over 30 years. They're one of the longest lived snakes. So they go back and forth to the same dens, and there's a lot of changes in the landscape between those in the amount of time. You know, suddenly a highway's put in, a new home goes in, and they got to cross, you know, a yard that didn't used to be there, a highway that didn't used to be there, and that's when we start seeing these things. So moving a rattlesnake a great distance away might be a death sentence for it because it does not know where to den. A copperhead, I think, would be more adaptable and would probably survive somewhere else. You know, but the best thing is never move anything very far away from where it came. And rattlesnakes probably at the most just a few hundred yards. So, okay, so I'm going to pull out just a typical mountain copperhead, and I won't get very close. I'll hold him up right here. So, but usually when I show people a typical mountain copperhead, I thought those things were, you know, they always look bigger when you're afraid of them, you know. But yes, I've seen copperheads that were much bigger, but this is typical size, you know, about 2.5 feet. They do get bigger, but they're a shy snake, and this is just an average size copperhead, average color copperhead, kind of dark in overall color. You know, the pattern remains somewhat the same, cross bands or hourglass pattern, kind of narrow at the back and wide on the side. It's hard to get people to sympathize with copperheads, but copperheads are beautiful snakes, but they're extremely shy. And like I said, unless you put your hand right on one, or you step on, I mean, I've even seen people stand on one that weren't bitten, you know, so they're just extremely shy snakes. And with all the copperheads that I know exist around our area, and the few bites that occur, It's absolutely amazing. But the main thing is, when you're gardening, don't put your hands in places where you can't see. Don't reach in dark locations. Don't put your hand under a rock and pull it up without making sure that there's, where you put your hand, because a snake could be lying beside a rock, beside a log, anything like that. But these things blend in so well that people step on them, they put their hands on them, and they just don't see them. But the bite is serious, painful, but generally not life-threatening, but a very serious thing. So don't be bitten by a copperhead. It doesn't help the copperhead's reputation. You need to let one bite you. Any question about the copperhead? And then we'll pull out a snake that you can pick up and handle. Yeah. Okay. All right, so we'll put him back in his little box here. And then we'll put out a nice, friendly black rat snake. By the way, I've got a little baby, it's a hatchling black rat snake to show you first. This is actually one that's about a year of age right here. So he's starting to lose some of the grayish background. It's kind of darkening up. But as they shed their skin, every time they shed their skin, they darken, 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 darken. Some by the time they're 3 or 4 years of age are completely black. Others will retain a little bit of this juvenile pattern their entire life. In fact, the adult one I'm going to show you here and let you touch actually has a little trace of this juvenile pattern still left in it, and it's probably about 10 years of age. This one here is about a year old. Hatched to have an egg about last year. This one was rescued from the middle of the highway, and we use it for education programs.
So at that age, insects is what they're eating?
At this age, they're probably eating little small lizards a lot of times, maybe little frogs, but not rodents. They don't probably eat that until they get a little bit older. But they might eat some large insect of some sort. And then when they get full grown, this one's still, snakes grow their entire life, but black rat snakes average 4 to 6 feet as an adult. The biggest I've ever seen, I've had 2 in my possession in the past few years that were just under 7 feet, that were massive, massive snakes. But this is more of a typical large adult, which is between 5 and 6 feet here. And this one is a very, very friendly one. And but you'll see that this one has a lot of trace of the pattern still left on it from when it was a juvenile. A lot of snakes this size will have no pattern left. It'll be a solid, shiny black. So they're just very variable. But this one's very friendly, very tame. Somebody actually got this one as a baby like that and raised it and handled it and made a pet out of it, and eventually had to get rid of it and gave it to me. So this snake only spent a short amount of time, maybe a few months in the wild, but this snake just shed its skin a couple of days ago. So you're free to touch your snake if you like to. And after you touch him, I'll even let you handle him a little bit if you like.
Do you have an opinion about non-venomous snakes as pets?
About what?
Non-venomous
snake. I think there's nothing wrong with it as long as you do it responsibly. The big thing is it's best not to take a snake out of the wild, because snakes are not nearly as common as they used to be. And if you take a snake out of the wild, it's just like you killed it, even though you didn't, you took it out of the wild. So it's, from nature's standpoint, it's not there anymore. And most wild snakes, particularly if they're adults, they don't calm down to become very tame. So there's a lot of people that actually breed snakes in captivity for the pet trade, captive bred snakes that aren't coming out of the wild. So that relieves the pressure on the wild. So if you want a pet snake, I think that's great. Just try to get one from a captive-born population and get one of the species of snakes that does well in captivity. Rat snakes always do good. Corn snakes do good because they're a rat snake. Some other species of snakes are just not very suitable as pet snakes. It depends whether you want one to look at or you want one to handle. And if you want one to handle, you want one of the rodent eaters as a constrictor. These are constrictors. They wrap their bodies around their prey to kill it while they're holding on to it with their teeth. But then some people don't like the idea of feeding rodents to a snake because they like the mice. They're cute. But you feed them pre-killed rodents that are already dead. And if you don't want to go to the pet store and buy them, you can order them from internet breeders, and they're shipped in frozen in a little package, and all you got to do is thaw them out and then feed them to the snake. And you don't have to feel guilty about anything because they're laboratory raised for the snake pet trade industry, which is huge, believe it or not. And there's a lot of captive snakes that are available. Beautiful snakes of very good varieties that make very good pets, and rat snakes and king snakes are some of the very best ones to have. But you need to know a little bit about snakes and know about their little quirks.
Don't touch
You know, and they're not a dog, they're not a cat, they're something very different. But for the right person, they're a very interesting animal to have, and gives you a good appreciation of the world of nature by getting to know a snake and their role in the ecology of things. And I think it'll make a better person out of you by getting to know a snake, because snakes need friends, and once you know a little bit about snakes, you can pass that appreciation of the snakes on to other living creatures and realize that everything has a purpose and a reason for being here. And that's where I got my start being a naturalist, is working and playing with snakes. It gave me appreciation for all the other things out there, and a respect for all living life forms. So.
Feel every muscle.
I see some nice smiles, and these looking at you can tell they really like touching the snake.
Well, we always see them in the yard,
Yeah.
like see
Yeah.
them climbing trees.
Yeah.
and-
So don't play with the snakes you see in the wild, because they are, you know, they're wild snakes and they might bite. But a nice tame friendly snake like this, you know, is a good snake to handle and get to know, and actually makes a pretty good companion if you take care of him.
So how about that? How about various bites from non-venomous snakes?
Uh,
No real threat, probably?
No real threat. I mean, it's just like being scratched by thorns or briars or something. Very, very little risk of infection or anything like that, you know. So just wash it off with a little soap and water, you should be fine. Yeah. There are some species of snakes, like garter snakes, that are non-venomous, that research shows that they actually have a little bit of a toxic saliva that's dangerous to the prey they feed on. So something like a hognose snake or a garter snake that might feed on toads and frogs, they actually have a mild venom in their saliva that evidently sedates their prey and that sort of thing, and makes it easy for them to eat. And but if that same snake was to bite you, it probably wouldn't do anything, because it's very species specific. But there have been a couple of weird instances where somebody was bitten by a garter snake, their arm swelled up, there might have been some kind of weird bacteria in the snake's mouth or something. You know, some people are more sensitive to things than other people are, you know. So some of those snakes like that are considered to be weakly venomous, mildly venomous, with a very species-specific saliva or enzyme that attacks your prey. But things like the things that are rodent eaters that kill their prey, like constriction, have none of those properties to the saliva. I mean, totally, it's just not going to happen.
Are you offering a chance for people to hold?
Yeah, sure. Anybody wants to hold this guy or gal? This is a female. Come on up. She's a very friendly. This is about as friendly a snake as you'll ever probably meet.
I'm just amazed at how muscular they are. The strength of them.
Put him around your neck. I'm going to turn around and face the camera. So when you hold a snake, you basically let the snake hold you. If you do that right, the snake holds you, and you think you're holding a snake.
You're so warm, they like you.
Can you feel its strength? How strong it is?
How large of a habitat do you need to give a snake?
You mean as a pet snake? A snake like that can actually be kept in something like a 15 or 20 gallon aquarium. Something about that long, about that wide, and that high. You know, they don't really need a lot of space in captivity, because usually a snake is coiled up under something. You know, if they're roaming, they're hungry, or they're not warm enough, or they're too cool or something. And that's what makes them move around. But if they're happy, temperature's right, well fed, we're just going to coil up in this corner and just stay there pretty much. You know,
They don't need curiosity.
they don't need to necessarily completely stretch out or anything like that. And they can make laps around the inside of the cage for exercise they need.
But are they wanting for like stimulation or change in the environment?
Not really. I don't think so. You know, they're not one. You know, some animals in captivity, they do what's called enrichment with mammals. You know, they get bored.
Yeah.
Snakes are not like that. They got a more primitive mind. You know, as long as they're warm enough and they're getting fed, they should be fine. But they do have certain psychological needs. So, you know, if you have a snake and it's not eating, a lot of times it's maybe because you don't have a shelter. They're used to spend a lot of their time hiding. So they got to have a hide box or something which resembles the underneath of a rock or a hollow log in the wild. You know, so psychologically they feel out in the open. But you suddenly give them that shelter, and then they'll suddenly start to eat. But if they don't, then the temperature is not right. You know, the temperature's got to be between a certain level, you know, with certain snakes, and the humidity level needs to be a certain level and that kind of stuff. So, but just a few basic needs, you know, and if you know what those basic needs are, a snake can be a pretty good companion.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You know, I don't think people ever get to appreciate a snake unless they touch a nice, friendly pet snake. There's something about touching a snake that just changes your mind. I know when I was a kid, I was terrified of snakes because you're taught to be afraid of snakes, you know, by your parents and brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, somebody. Otherwise, you're probably pretty curious about snakes and most other things. But I remember being terrified of snakes as a youngster until I went to a zoo program where they talked about snakes and dispelled a lot of the myths and stories about snakes that most people believed. And I found out most things I'd been taught was just a pack of lies, you know, even at an early age when I was like 8 years old. And then they asked, anybody would like to touch this snake? You know, before that, you couldn't have got me near a snake, you know. And every time I saw a snake in the wild, I would run from it. I never would harm it or try to kill it like some people would, but I just remember when I touched that snake after hearing all these good things, and I was at that impressionable age and touching a snake for the first time, it was just like you're in a dark room, you turn the lights on, you see the world for what it was for the very first time. You know, and snakes were not the frightening thing I'd been taught they were. And suddenly I had a new interest. Snakes were cool things instead of being frightening things. And I couldn't wait to go out and catch a snake at that point, you know. So many people spend so much of their time being afraid of being outdoors and seeing snakes, and you know, just to me, I get excited when I do see a snake. You know, it's not sure they startle me sometimes, you know, and that sort of thing, but I look forward to having those little encounters with snakes and other critters now. So.
The only one that did.
It's female?
This one's a female, yeah.
And how do you sex a snake?
You have to look at their tail, and other than that, there's not much difference. But on on this snake, from here down is the tail, from my fingers here. So there's a cloaca, the body opening here, where all the waste products come out and everything. And on a female snake of this size, it begins to taper from that cloaca or vent quickly and evenly to a tip here. But if it's a male snake, the reproductive organs are actually in the base of the tail, past the cloaca, so it makes the bottom of the tail a little swollen, thickened area for the next couple inches, and then it begins to taper.
So there's a bulge.
Yeah. But some snakes just more obvious than others, and if you're a snake breeder and you couldn't easily tell by looking, sometimes you have to use a little metal probe that you slide in. That's maybe a little uncomfortable for the snake.
Yeah.
To tell whether there's reproductive organs there or not, you know. So there's ways of sexing snakes that way to be 100% sure, you know, if you're trying to breed them or that sort of stuff. But with rat snakes, it's usually you can usually tell just by looking. They're usually pretty obvious.
Are you a nice snake? It's really pretty. Are you a good snake or are you a bad snake? I don't want to hug a snake.
All snakes are good. Just some snakes are more good than others.
More dangerous than others.
I love that.
But this is a very, very gentle snake. Very gentle. The snake's been handled a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing her.
Yeah, by small people to big people. So.
Lauren, you want to hold?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
Can I transfer straight
Sure,
to her?
sure.
Oh, he's like tight.
Yeah.
Tight.
They want to tighten up so that, you know, it's kind of like the snake's up in a tree now. He doesn't want to slip and fall, so he's going to tighten up against you, make sure he's not going to fall to the ground. But that's one of the nice things I like about a constrictor. It does that. And once you get used to a snake, you like it tightening up against you. It feels good. You know? You know?
This is a serious snake happening right now.
Way too big.
But until you get used to it, it can be a little intimidating.
I'm warm because I'm a little scared too. Like so tight you don't even have to hold on. That's so cool. He's nice. I don't think I need one as a pet though. That's alright. But he's super nice. You're a nice guy. You want to hold him? Sure. I don't think I can get him off though. I think that's all you. He's going in my shirt.
Yeah, they like to investigate dark, warm places, which can sometimes be a little
my armpit
little
and down my
intimidating.
in my shirt.
Oh man.
That was crazy. It doesn't feel weight on your neck.
Not really.
Yeah, we held a snake in as well. I was the one kid in kindergarten that went up and held the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the little boys respected me after that. I love snakes. They're so beautiful.
Does he have a name?
You know, I've never given the snake a name. I should. I should because I use it so much more than some of the other snakes I have, and you know, it's so handleable. So I really need a. But I'm funny about names. It's got to be a good name, or I won't use it. I mean, I don't want it to be the same name that every other black rat snake has. It can't be Blackie. It's got to be more original than that. So I'm open to suggestions, but call it what? Steve's a snake.
It's a girl. It's a
Stevie.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yay!
Thanks.